Is Brittany Choate. I'm Director of Programs with Saliva Direct Inc. We are a public health nonprofit dedicated to advancing more accessible diagnostic testing solutions, and we do that through developments of new saliva-based tests, as well as hosting events like this. We're doing our best to respond to evolving global health challenges, and we do our best to advocate, promote, and advance diagnostic solutions. So very excited to have you all here joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this edition of our diagnostics webinar series, where we not only have panelists joining us from around the world, but we also have participants joining us from 15 different countries today. So welcome across many, many time zones. Good morning, good afternoon, good night for those of you who might be joining us a little bit later in your day. As you all will have seen from today's agenda, this is a special Women's Health edition of our webinar series, and we were able to schedule it to coincide with International Women's Day, which is going to be happening later this week on Saturday. We're very fortunate to have an amazing panel of women joining us today to share about their research and advancements in women-centered healthcare. On today's webinar, we have Dr. Sarah Naziri, Dr. Diana Domick, and Kat Holloway. First up, Dr. Sarah Naziri is the co-founder and CEO of Quinn, as well as the developer of Quinn's pioneering Q-Pad for Women, a non-invasive, convenient menstrual pad that eliminates common barriers to laboratory testing, such as access, health screening adherence, time, and cost, while providing critical health insights. Also joining us today is Dr. Diana Domick and Kat Holloway from TCAN. Dr. Diana is a biochemist based in Hamburg who works as a product manager at TCAN, focusing on innovative solutions like saliva diagnostics that make a real difference in people's lives. Kat Holloway's journey into life sciences has spanned insurance, healthcare, marketing, biotech, and for the last several years, life sciences, where she finds purpose in partnering with colleagues and customers to advance the frontiers of medicine and science. Before we begin the presentations, just a few housekeeping notes. Each presentation set will have about 20 minutes for their talk. We'll stay in this same Zoom link in this same Zoom room for both of those sessions. After each panelist presents, they'll have about 5 minutes available for questions and answers from the audience. Please use the Q&A chat feature that's at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. I'll be monitoring those throughout, and we'll read those questions out at the end of each panelist's time. I also want to remind everyone that the webinar today is being recorded, and a copy of the webinar will be made available after the event. Finally, for those interested in those PACE continuing education credit for the webinar, be sure to stay for the entire event. After the webinar concludes, you'll be able to download your certificate directly from this vFLAIRS platform that we're on. So with those announcements complete, I'm pleased to move on to introducing our first speaker. Up first is Dr. Sarah Naziri, co-founder and CEO of Quinn. She will be presenting her talk titled Innovation in Women's Health, FDA-cleared lab testing using menstrual blood. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Brittany. It's so good to be here. Very excited to talk a little bit about the diagnostic utility of menstrual blood, and also excited to hear all of you guys' questions. So with that in mind, let me quickly share my screen. Hopefully you can see my screen now, if that's looking good. So real quick, the company name that I work with is Quinn, and it actually means woman in Danish, because both myself and my co-founder are from Denmark originally. So it's kind of a little bit of a connection to back home for us. And we are a women's health company, and our mission really is to empower women. We focus on the early side of any diagnostics, so really on the preventative side, and I'd say even on as early as the screening side of things, and don't our work is not on the later stage diagnostics of conditions. So a little bit about the company, and really what we do. How do we do that? How do we empower women? And we actually utilize menstrual blood, which is a bodily fluid that hasn't been subject to a lot of research up until now, but is actually a very, very interesting bodily fluid when it comes to healthcare. And in particular, it consists of not only systemic blood. So if you go down to the lab or to the doctor's office and they do a venipuncture, for a lot of the testing we do today, of course, we use systemic blood, and menstrual blood contains that information. So in that way, very rich in relevant health biomarkers. But in addition to systemic blood, we also have access to endometrial tissue and vaginal fluid. And we know that there's a little bit less than 400 unique proteins in menstrual blood that tells us information specifically about the reproductive organs. So, as we started Quinn, at the time, there'd only been one paper published on what menstrual blood was, on the proteomics of menstrual blood. And so for the first couple of years, and still today of the company, we've really been spending a lot of time in understanding the utility and understanding how this bodily fluid can be useful in the clinic and for patients. So very exciting. And this unique composition really unlocks solutions to some of these big women's health issues that we have today that affect a lot of women globally, but and where we really don't have, either we don't have a diagnostic for it today, or where the diagnostic is very sort of it's invasive or inaccessible to women. So a lot of room for sort of improvements here. And we believe because of this unique composition that menstrual blood has, there's a really unique opportunity here to solve for some of these big issues. So how do we capture that opportunity? We've built a product, we call it the Q-Pad, and essentially it's a modified menstrual pad that looks, feels, and is used like a normal menstrual pad. So for women, this is sort of very intuitive. The difference being that it has a small strip embedded that collects a specific volume of blood from which we can do different kinds of testing. The Q-Pad is built on organic cotton, and so no chemicals added, which is of course good for many reasons, but in particular for health testing purposes, of course, this was important for us. With the Q-Pad, there's also an app that comes along with it. The app is a way to engage with the user. It's also a way of how we share the results. So once we've done the testing, women can see on this app what the results were, also where they see the instructions to the Q-Pad. So in many ways, the use of the Q-Pad, it goes hand in hand with this mobile app as well. And this is a video just sort of showing the process of how it works. So I'll just kind of press play here and speak over the video. And again, the first thing you do is actually to download the app. That's how you register your kit. And then you use the Q-Pad like any other menstrual pad. On average, women use it for 2 to 4 hours. You then pull a little tab that removes that collection strip, which is placed in a little container that comes with the kit and then placed in an envelope that is pre-stamped. That is then put in a mailbox, and we then receive it at the laboratory. And about a week later, you receive your results, and you can sort of see over time how different levels are changing. And I think I might have to go out of. I think it's a very exciting time for women's health in general, and in particular, we were able to obtain FDA clearance, which of course, big moment for us at Quinn. But really, I would say for women's health as a whole, that the first diagnostic menstrual pad was able to obtain this FDA clearance really kind of sets the stage for menstrual blood being a potential game changer in women's health, and opening up for a lot of opportunities for how we screen for different health biomarkers, and also how we think about accessibility in healthcare, given that women, of course, bleed naturally and can collect at home, and which solves for a lot of the barriers that we do see with accessibility. So very exciting moment here. And this particular FDA clearance, we were able to obtain for at-home collection, of course, and in particular for a biomarker called hemoglobin A1C. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. Yeah, so one indication I wanted to talk a little bit more about as it comes to the usability of menstrual blood is something like cervical cancer, which of course affects a lot of women worldwide. Still today kills 350,000 women, which is unfortunate because this is a cancer that actually is entirely preventable. If we screen for it, we can prevent women from dying of cervical cancer. And so really the question is, how do we make screening more accessible for women to make sure this doesn't happen? Let's see here. So a little bit about the screening today. The way that it works is, of course, a woman comes to the clinic, gets undressed, gets on the table. We insert the speculum and we collect cells from her cervix. And from that sample, we are able to detect, some of the biomarkers that are used for screening for cervical cancer. When we ask women, why are they not getting screened today? These are some of the reasons that come up. So cost, anxiety, embarrassment, anticipation of pain. are some of the reasons that women are not getting screened. We are seeing that the adherence to screening actually is dropping and has been dropping for almost a decade now. The drop in adherence was in particular high, of course, during COVID, where it almost feels like for the first time population was sort of aware that actually going to the clinic and going to the hospital came with risk, right? Risk of obtaining COVID in this case, but that really made that drop in screening quite significant. But that was a general trend, and of course, the issue with women not getting screened is we're not able to detect the cancer early, which means the disease is able to progress, which is costly, and of course has personal and emotional consequences that are quite devastating. When we asked women if they would prefer the QPAD over the Pap smear, 94% said that they would, which is, of course, very exciting. And this was a study done at Stanford University Hospital where women were receiving the QPAD and also coming in for the Pap smear and then asked afterwards. When we asked them why, it's basically because it takes away a lot of the barriers that are prohibiting women from getting screening done today, with the exception of finding cancer, of course, because it turns out the QPAT actually is able to screen for high risk HPV, which is the biomarker we look for screening cervical cancer quite well. And so we're seeing that the concordance between the clinician collected sample and the QPAT sample is very high. And really interestingly, we're actually detecting more cases than the clinician is. And we sort of discuss a lot in the paper that is published as well, which you can of course read more about these results. It's also discussed why that would be, and we think the reason is because menstrual blood, of course, travels through the entire canal. You're getting a really good representation of the entire endometrium and the cervical lining, which is why we're catching more cases. In some instances, especially among young women or women who haven't had children or have had children, which is many, many years ago, the cervix can be quite tight and it can be quite hard for the clinician to collect the sample a little bit higher up in the cervix. And so for some of these cases, we find that actually, interestingly enough, menstrual blood is able to give us a really good sample to detect that. Um, when we look at other research we've done, we've looked at a number of different biomarkers that are clinically relevant and in general, so, biomarkers we test for quite regularly in the clinic, and we're seeing a really high correlation as well when we look at menstrual blood. This is actually data from the very first study we published in collaboration with Stanford University Hospital and some of the biomarkers that we looked at the time. And since then, as we've sort of come to the conclusion that not only, of course, is it interesting that menstrual blood actually has value, which I think is a completely new view on menstrual blood as a whole, but the way we collect menstrual blood actually matters tremendously for how the correlation looks. And so, as we've been testing different ways to collect, we're seeing that the correlation is improving quite significantly. And part of the work with the QPAD in particular has been to ensure that collection is consistent and that the sample is sort of stabilized once it is collected, and in that way we can able to be shipped from various locations in the country. But this is just sort of a kind of a little bit of data from the first study we did, and a little bit more data on other biomarkers as well. Here are some of the biomarkers that a lot of women have actually asked for. When we interview women, we've probably talked to, I mean, more than 1,000 women at this point to see, what are women actually mostly concerned about? What is top of mind for what they want to monitor? And these are some of the ones that oftentimes come up, of course, relating to, general health, but certainly also fertility hormones here, and thyroid as well. And we're seeing really, really promising results here as well. Um, in particular, one of the assays is hemoglobin A1C, which is a biomarker that is used for its average blood sugar, right? So it's a biomarker that generally is important to keep track of, but in particular among the pre-diabetic and the diabetic population, this is how we diagnose diabetes. This is what we test for when we are altering treatments for diabetes, etc. So very important biomarker. And interestingly enough, when we detect and monitor it in the QPAD, we're seeing very, very high correlation when we compare to systemic blood draws. And this is also what was FDA cleared. So very, very exciting moment for women's health and menstrual blood in general. In terms of what has been fully validated, these are the biomarkers that have been fully validated in a clinical laboratory. And what I mean by that is that we've not only looked at correlation here, but also stability, shipping it from all these different locations in the country, temperature, testing it at high, at extreme temperatures, interference testing, and all these things that are considered important when we think about a full validation. And they range from, of course, hemoglobin A1C, fertility, thyroid, inflammation, and then, of course, high risk HPV, which is the cervical cancer screening assay. I just really wanted to mention that, with these findings and this research that we are publishing, we're still just scratching the surface of what's possible with menstrual blood. It sort of blows my mind as a woman and as a medical doctor that the very first paper that was ever published on the proteomics of menstrual blood was actually in 2012. So it's still just the beginning of understanding what the utility is here, and a lot more research has to be done to really truly understand where this can be helpful in clinic outside of the essays that we've already talked about. And talking about women's health, it is an area of healthcare, unfortunately, that has been overlooked. And of course, we know that women were included in medical research consistently for the majority of medical research history. And so there is really a need to catch up a little bit on the research side. Let me see if I can do it now. Yeah, there we go. And really, yeah, as the slide says, really not until 1993 that women by law were required to be included in clinical trials. So there is this gender data gap in women's health that is quite concerning, and we need to find ways where we can accelerate the research in women's health to close that gender data gap, to make sure that the diagnosis and the treatments that we are offering today, but also the new ones that we're coming up with, are accurate and represent sort of capture female biology equally to male biology. Um, and we are seeing that even in studies, and this is even today, where the majority of patients are female, that the majority of the participants in the trials are actually male. So there's just an odd kind of skewed bias towards not having female biology represented, and that poses a problem. One example is in chronic pain patients. We know that the majority of chronic pain patients are in fact female, but when you look at the research that is being done, a majority of the participants are male. And so there is definitely a need to see how we can make sure that moving forward, that we have equal representation of male and female biology. So just a little bit of a kind of encouragement here. I like the importance of participating in research, right? At the end of the day, if we don't participate, our data won't be represented. So that's really, really important to be represented in the data, and hopefully, together be able to create the future of women's health that hopefully doesn't have as many gaps as unfortunately is the case today. So with that in mind, thank you so much for your attention and for listening. Very excited to hear if there are any questions to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nassiri. And for those that have questions, please use that Q&A feature in the bottom of your screen through the bottom of the Zoom window, so that way we can pull those along. While we're waiting for questions to be dropped over in the Q&A chat, it was very striking to me, and I saw some other panelists nodding their head as well, of the similarities in terms of why you're pursuing menstrual blood and why we, in a lot of cases, are folks that are pursuing saliva as this non-invasive sample type, something that can perhaps be more indicative than just a single drop, where, with the saliva, you're getting access to something that comes in contact with a lot of different places in the body. Same thing with what you were sharing with menstrual blood, for example. So I thought that was a really interesting correlation. One of the things that stood out was particularly the stability of the sample type, and you'd mentioned about it being able to go through different heat cycles and things. That's something our team has done with saliva samples as well. I'd be curious if you would share more about how that plays into maybe plans that Quinn has for increasing diagnostic access, maybe in lower resources or more remote settings.
Absolutely. Actually, one of the very early studies we did was done in rural Zimbabwe.
Mm.
And so, the temperatures there are much higher than we are used to, and also humidity can get quite extreme. And
Mm.
so, as we think about validating the QPAD, and in particular for these biomarkers that have been validated, we expose them to very high temperatures and humidity to make sure that the sample stays stable. And that's a little bit back to kind of how it's collected. Because of course, one thing is the sample itself, but actually what we find that has a huge impact on the correlation is how it's collected, right? How is it stored? How is it collected? And so that's something we've kept in mind from the very early days, because some of our work actually was done in lower resource settings where there is no temperature control, there is no refrigerator, there is no quick way to get the sample to the laboratory. In many cases, in this particular setting, the way that the sample would come back to the clinic was that the hospital had a truck essentially that would rotate through these rural villages that were quite far away actually, and this was done every second week. So you need a way to maintain sample stability for 2 weeks minimum. And for these biomarkers, we are seeing that is definitely possible with the way that the sample is stored. And that's some of the work that we've spent years on, iterating on how the sample is collected, how it's dried down in particular,
Yeah.
to make sure that the biomarkers are stable. And of course, the stability varies a little bit on from assay to assay. But for something like hemoglobin, like I'll give you an example, for something like hemoglobin A1C with the QPAD system, we have about a month stability,
Mhm.
28 days to be accurate. And then on the other end of the high risk HPV for the cervical cancer indication, we're talking, 3 months plus. So it depends a little bit on the assay as well.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. There was a couple questions that came through while you were answering that one. One is a bit related to what you were just sharing. First of all, thanks for sharing your work. Very exciting was the intro. Do you have plans to obtain clearances for other analytes beyond HbA1c?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was actually quite a significant change in FDA regulatory sort of guidelines in the summer of 2024. So a lot of these assays were validated in a clinical laboratory outside of the FDA clearance that was mostly on the device itself, and then you attach an assay. But with the change in the new guidelines, a lot of the LDTs in clinical laboratories now also have to go through the FDA, and so that's absolutely a work in progress for us to kind of make sure that we go through the right regulatory bodies before we offer these. So yes, the short answer is yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. We
Yeah.
we have some experience with our internal team of just how much that process can involve and how
Oh
much time
yeah.
it can take. So certainly can appreciate that it's a process and it's in the works.
Oh yeah.
One
Absolutely.
last question that came through, and actually it aligns with one that I had on my notes actually to ask you is thinking about all the different partnerships and all of the individuals that have been involved. It sounds like you've had a really great band of people who have helped move this forward and make it go the way that it has and be able to advance it. But what are the greatest barriers you see in terms of the uptake and where this goes in the future of the QPAD technology?
It's the barriers in my mind are time and resources, right? Because, and I even think, when we think about women's health as a whole, we are just behind. And for any of these to actually make it to where we want them to go, where they do have the impact that we all hope for, it's a long development cycle, right? And it takes time, it takes resources. And frankly, back to what you said just before you finished your question, Brittany, it takes more than one. We need to collaborate, right? Between institutions, organizations, and companies that are innovating in the space. We need everybody sort of to come together to be able to really create the impact that we're hoping for. And so I think, investment in women's health, and then of course, the time being, it just does take time to get these through. And with the regulatory environment changing, and it has been changing quite a lot, and now again we are sort of seeing with the new government that there is again some delays, and these things are what puts us a little bit behind even further than we had hoped. But I think back to kind of, yeah, the partnerships and collaboration, I think will be very important. Also because we are, as I mentioned, just scratching the surface here. We know that menstrual blood contains, as I mentioned, a little bit less than 400 unique proteins, and how they relate to specific indications in women's health and their reproductive organs yet to be really defined, right? So we are looking at here, what we're looking at here are clinically relevant. We are very well aware of these particular biomarkers, what they mean, what does it mean when it's high, low, how do we treat these kinds of things. But there's a whole other area of the menstrual blood potential where there are new biomarkers here that we have yet to understand. How can they be helpful in diagnosing endometriosis and PCOS and all these other very big important women's health issues? And so I think the more collaboration we can have for those, I think will be important to really have the impact that we hope this will have.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Nasiri. Appreciate that. And seems like a very good note to end that one on. But if anyone else has additional questions, please put them in the Q&A chat. As we have time, we'll circle back to them at the end of the presentation, or I'll be more than happy to connect them with Dr. Nasiri after today's presentation as well. So that way no questions go unanswered. Thank you. Appreciate you sharing that. Our next presentation is going to be offered by Dr. Diana Domick and Kat Holloway of TCAN. They're going to be co-presenting this, and their talk title is Small Sample, Big Insights, the Science of Saliva Testing. Diana and Kat, over to you.
And Kat and I are very happy to talk about Small Sample, Big Insights, the Science of Saliva Testing. And I will start with the little agenda we prepared. So we will touch on specialty diagnostics, the benefits of saliva, and then also speak about the trends in saliva we have seen, especially here in testing, proficiency testing. And then also I will show a slide which is indicating where the interest lies, which kind of analytes are measured in saliva especially. And then we have a whole slide prepared with additional resources. It doesn't matter if you're a beginner in this kind of area or an expert, we have everything. And then we end this talk with a summary and an outlook. To give you a little bit of a context, Kat and I are both working at TCAN. I'm also working at IBM International, which is part of TCAN. And a couple of years back already, we celebrated a big anniversary. So we celebrated 40 years of specialty diagnostics. It started with a need we have seen, and there was not a solution available, and radioimmunoassays were not that common. Since then, a lot of things happened, and now we offer a lot of different assays, immunoassays, ELISAs, like luminescence assays as well. And we branched also out to LCMS. We have different topics we are covering: endocrinology, immunology, and autoimmunity. And we want to talk here more about saliva, but also we have solutions for blood, urine, and CSF. But more about saliva. And this slide, I really like this picture because it's illustrating very nicely why saliva has so many benefits. So if we start from the left, in blood, we have basically very simplified two different fractions. So we have a bound fraction of steroids, so the blue dot connected to the red one. And we have also the free fraction of steroids, so the red dots. And all of this in blood makes up a lot. So the bound fraction is 95%. Depends a little bit which steroid we are also talking about. And then in saliva naturally occurring, we have about 5% of the free steroid fraction. And this is very nice because it's the biologically active fraction. So this actually gives you information about the health status of a patient and actually what level you want to know more about. And because the saliva is entering through a membrane into the mouth, you will only have the biologically active fraction. As we all know that collecting saliva is fairly easy, it's non-invasive, there are no needles involved, which is reducing the stress immensely if you have fear of needles, for example. And the beauty is also that you can basically collect the sample anywhere. Also, anytime you can do that at home. You don't need like special assistance or training. Anybody can do that. So it's very suitable for critical patients, I would say, like children or seniors, so they can do that also very easily. And what is really interesting also, I guess, the aspect in research and science is that you can have a snapshot directly about what is going on. If we are thinking of stress testing and want to measure cortisol, you can directly do that after collect a sample, after you stressed the poor students, for example. And then saliva is fairly stable. And this is ideal also then for screening. What I also want to touch on is that saliva is a different matrix compared to blood. And here the pre-analytic side is very important to have the results to be correct in the end. And there are a couple of things you have to keep in mind. And one is blood contamination. So what we did here is we tested different percentages of volume of blood in the sample. So you can already see very easily if you have small amount of blood in the saliva samples. So you look at 0.75%, you have already a tint in there. So it's slightly yellow, slightly orange. And then at 0.156%, it's super visible, and you should really avoid that, because what will happen is that you have all the fractions, the bound fraction and the free fraction in there. So the two slides before I showed you, everything will be now in the saliva, because maybe you have a wound in your mouth and this is where the membrane was torn, and so blood entered also the saliva, and it will artificially increase the results because you have all the fractions in there, and you really not use these kind of samples. But if that happens also during collection, it's really not a big problem. So what you basically do, you rinse the collection tube with tap water. This is totally fine. You rinse your mouth also. Ideally, the bleeding should have stopped. And then you just simply repeat the collection. And then you can measure a perfectly fine result. We focus mostly on steroids you can measure in saliva, but there are many other analytes you can measure in saliva. It's a very versatile sample type. And what I want to show you here in this slide is basically an overview about the steroid pathway and all the compounds and how they are connected to each other. Ideally, you should always approach this with a very holistic view and not only pick one analyte and diagnose on the basis of that, but pick a couple of them and then also have a better insight in what might be going on with a patient, for example. So if we start from the left side, progesterone and 17-OHP, for example, together with the estrogens, estrone, estradiol, and estradiol, are very interesting if you consider to investigate women's health. So if you want to see more about the menstrual cycle, how progesterone and estradiol are, what the levels are. And also it gives you hints about fertility, about amenorrhea or PCOS. So for PCOS, you would also investigate what the level of testosterone is, because testosterone is normally in women quite low. But in case of polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS, it would be very high. And men, testosterone is normally very high, but with age, it also declines. This could also be a health issue if it's beyond the normal level. So fertility is also something you could then look at. Another good point is always cortisol, known as the stress hormone, but also you can measure cortisol to know if there are adrenal diseases. For example, with Cushing's syndrome, it would be very high. With Addison's disease, it would be very low. And very interesting is always to look at cortisol and DHEA and the ratio between them. which gives you also more information. Since we are in the saliva business for such a long time, so over 20 years, we compiled a lot of knowledge and we measured a lot of different things throughout the time. We compiled everything in our own book, the Viva Saliva book. And this here basically gives you an extract out of the book. So it's dedicated to 5 different hormones, including progesterone and estradiol. And what we did also is track the menstrual cycle here. You can see that in the picture, that throughout the whole cycle, saliva samples were taken to understand the levels of these 2 hormones and then also draw conclusions from that, if it's a normal level or not. And generating this data is quite easy because you can collect the saliva samples anywhere. And then also we had one colleague, when she was pregnant, we also had to, of course, give us a couple of saliva samples. So her data is also in here. And then with estradiol, you also can see that it's very individual. If you look to the right-hand side, that normally there is no one menstrual cycle for a woman, and also the length is very different. And this is all can be seen if you actually track it. As promised, I would also touch on the trends we have seen in saliva testing in general, which is of course very nice to see that the interest is increasing and also the participation. So all the years back, there was no reference material or like even no quality scheme available. So we created our own, which is the External Quality Assessment Scheme, the EQAS. So basically we sent out samples to customers who can measure them and then also compare them to the results and just see where they land with the results if they're basically measuring correctly. So we have seen that there's a huge interest. Every year we get more participants, and that cortisol and testosterone are very interesting to most participants, and especially in the field of LCMS measuring, which is state of the art. More and more laboratories participate with that method. And also we see that the field is also picking up on the trend because there is another proficiency test now on the market, so the UK version, so UK NIQAS. They also have a pilot study now with 3 different analytes, so you can also then participate here. They have cortisol, 70-OHP, and testosterone. And of course, we will talk about the benefits of our very own quality test assessment scheme, and this is where I hand it over to Kat, who will explain this.
Thank you. And I won't go into super granularity, but thank you, Diana. So one of the big things when we started our work in saliva was seeing that there was a gap in information. And at the time, when we started offering the PT testing back in 2005, there were no quality schemes or PT tests available. So listening to our customers and just seeing what do you need and having the ability to look at how you're comparing with other labs and peers and getting that information. So this is something that we've offered to the market for a long time now and do it free of charge. So definitely love participation, be interested to have more people join us in that. And it is similar to how Diana was pointing out, it's been interesting as methodologies have changed over the last couple of years, seeing the shift in what the kind of main modalities are and seeing a big uptick in LCMS has been a piece as well. And then Diana, if you want to progress.
I will.
All right, so bit of a flashback, but looking at the steroid kind of pathway, similar to what Diana was talking about, highlighting kind of the high level, but also the granular markers that let you get that holistic picture. So, the nice thing is we are a global company, so we have both US IVD options. So, looking at the core list of analytes, and those are going to be your main um, close to 5 markers, and then you've got the complementary ones, like if you're looking at, say, stress, but you also wanna put in some sleep kind of aspects, you can tie in, like, a melatonin or something like that, and then, being able to highlight different indications for people. So, being able to zoom in and share our kind of nerdy background, and one of my favorite stories about how IBL started and before we joined the TCAN group is there was a group of endocrinologists in Germany who were looking for a different kind of testing, and I feel like that theme is something that we've continued because we tend to focus on things that maybe there's a gap in research or there's still a need to answer more questions. So that's something, this is an area that I love to talk about. And Diana and I would be happy to talk to anybody who wants to get nerdy with us. So if you want to progress to the next slide. So one of the fun parts about this and just seeing especially appropriate in Women's Month, um, is hearing from some of the hormone experts, and this by no means is the research or the work done similar to what the previous presentation. There is a lot of research to still fill in the gaps. There is some resistance in the market on, is saliva a trustworthy sample? How do we feel about this? Different things, and going back to Diana's piece about pre-analytics and looking at the sample collection, the data that you start with is really critical for success. So a recent webinar that we hosted with Maureen Braun, who's a neurobiologist, naturopath, coach, and therapist in emotional release. She was digging in on the saliva parameters of cortisol and oxytocin, which are very tied in emotional responses. And some quotes from her that really stuck out to me is that hormones are huge regulators of emotion and bodily changes, and you can have impacts to your health on a really big scale, even to the extent of a loss of appetite, poor digestion, weakness in your immune system, insomnia, depression, fatigue, headaches. And then kind of switching sides, another presentation that we had was with Dr. Annette Mueller Alcazar, and she was digging in on the how biomarkers such as cortisol can look at stress, depression, anxiety, and highlighting their role in how we can understand mental health conditions. And when you look at cortisol and DHEA, you're looking at the axis between pituitary and adrenal. And then you've got the alpha amylase that's looking at nervous systems. And then with um, estrogens and testosterone, you're also looking at the pituitary and gonadal kind of axis with a couple other pieces in there. So definitely always nice to hear from the experts, and these are available if people want to dig in further. So just thinking about the one of the pieces that I my favorite parts about what I get to do is talking to labs or researchers or people that are like, okay, what could it look like if I added saliva to my research or my process? And I would say some of the key things to remember are the quality of the samples that you start with are really critical. So you want to think about, if you're using a commercial kit, what's their quality process? Are they regulated for IVDR? Are they compliant with FDA? Are they gonna kind of take some of the heavy lifting for that kind of paperwork piece, or having that resource network? And then just from the quality of results, like, what are they calibrating against? One of the things that we are very proud of is that we really make a point of calibrating against LCMS, which is one of the current gold standards for this. And then kind of switching gears a little bit, one of the things that's interesting too is with the pre-treatment of your samples and how you collect, which Diana spoke about too, especially for hormones, you can run into, if you're using a non-ideal collection tube, you can leave some of the analytes you're looking for behind. And if you think about that picture where you've got the blue dots with the red dots, which would be your hormones in blood, and then you've got the after it's gone through the membrane in your saliva, you're already looking for a very specific amount of what's biologically active. So to lose more of that information can really have an impact on your samples. And then another thing that we found is working with labs, and we build this into our IFU information, is that adding a freeze thaw cycle can also be really impactful, because we all know spit is a interesting sample type to work with. So being able to break up some of the mucus and viscosity can be really impactful. And then we talked about it earlier, but the proficiency test and quality, that can be really helpful, especially if you're in the CLIA or CAP environment. And then we have a really top-notch team that's been very nerdy and in the details and in the weeds on supporting customers for a long time. So happy to connect people and share information. And then at the bottom, there's 4 publications that are a good place to kind of start digging in. And then Diana, if you want to go to the next page. So not going to talk to every picture, but this is like a very high 100-foot view of how nerdy we've been the last 20 years. And this is by no means everything that we have, but we've liked to share that with the market as well. And then if you want to go to the last screen, Diana, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Kat. So with that, I want to quickly summarize what we just talked about, and then also give a brief outlook. So saliva definitely has so many benefits, and there is a reason why so many research labs and also people pick it up to be the next sample to be really used and become the mainstream sample next to blood, because it's non-invasive, it's very easy, not maybe always easy to work with, but very easy and accurate if you really stick to the pre-analytics and get them right. Then it's a really lovely sample type to work with. And we have seen definitely with the proficiency testing that there's a lot of people really like to participate here. There's an increase every year, not only with cortisol, where it's very established to also measure that in saliva, but also with the other steroid hormones. And we definitely see that also the labs are going to measure saliva with LCMS, which is definitely the gold standard. And what we really pride ourselves in is that we really strive to have like excellent quality and on also really good support. If there are like questions, we're always there and help. And what we really would like to see is that saliva testing will become like really common.
Say a piece of that too, and maybe our challenge or call to action for the folks on the call or people that are listening afterwards is, as a patient or a doctor or a lab professional, is how can you either ask for that as a sample type option? Because there are labs that offer this today in the States and globally. Like, what would it look like to look at your hormones in multiple sample types? And then if you're on the research side, how can you factor in saliva with your research approach? Because I think it's a really impactful sample type, but it's going to take each of us to move it to the center stage and build that confidence and kind of comfort level. So that's my plug.
So, and also if you want to get in contact with us, you can scan the QR code.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. We really appreciate it. And that, Kat, that was a beautiful segue into if anyone has questions or would like to ask anything directly. We've got a little bit of time for a question or two that might come through. If you send one through and we don't have time to get to it, again, I'll make sure that it circles back around to Diana and Kat and that we get a response over to you. One question that did come through during your presentation that I think we've got just enough time to address is what is the general stability time in days during shipping per biomarker / test for saliva samples? What are the temperature limitations?
Yeah, this is a great question. So in general, I would say saliva is super stable, and we also ship saliva samples at room temperature. And it really depends on the analyte you want to look at after. But even at ambient temperatures, I think 1 week is fine. I'm not saying for all, but for cortisol especially, it's very durable.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate that. With that, but first of all, wanted to, of course, acknowledge and appreciate our wonderful presenters today. Thank you for joining us to speak about women's health and be part of this panel that really, I think, has presented a great opportunity for us all and how we can get involved. So thank you again to Dr. Sarah Naziri, Dr. Diana Domek, and Kat Holloway.